Co-founder of the International Forum on Globalization and the Global Eco-Village Network, and is recipient of the Alternative Nobel Prize. Let's warmly welcome Helena Norberg-Hodge.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I love the title. For me, it's all about the great rethinking. Absolutely essential to our next steps on this planet. And in terms of what I have to offer, I want to start by saying that an economics of happiness is an economics that allows each and every one of us plenty of time to sing and dance and make music. I wish we had more time to continue with the music that just started. And in that regard, it's important to remember that virtually every culture on this planet engaged in more music, song, and dance than our contemporary culture does. And that's one of the lessons that I learned from the ancient cultures where I've worked, particularly from this ancient culture called Ladakh, or Little Tibet, where I've been working for the last 30 years. But I have, from that work, because of the interest in what we were doing there, had contact with countless groups around the world. And these language groups which have translated the book and the film based on the book, are groups from Burma to the Navajo to the Mongolians to the Burmese to, well, more than 42 language groups are using those materials because they tell us again and again that the story of Ladakh is our story too. And really the story that the ancient futures learning from Ladakh tells is how the modern economy creates unhappiness. And I also talk about how we might get out of that tragic trajectory, a so-called progress, a so-called growth that doesn't make us happy. So I think that by asking that question, for every decision that we're taking now, as an individual, as a community, as a society, we need to examine far more deeply, far more broadly than we have, what is it that makes human beings happy? And are these steps that we're about to take actually answering those needs? In a very broad way, I would say that which takes us away from nature takes us away from our inner nature. In other words, I think the wisdom that we are coming back to is an ancient wisdom, and that is the interdependence, the inextricable connectedness of everything that lives, and the fact that we are a part of that web. It's said so often in ecological circles, and we all quote Chief Seattle, who said it so beautifully. And yet I think that we don't examine carefully enough often how much of what we buy into as progress or growth or development is actually taking us away from that sense, that experience of interdependence, that experience that is at the fundament, at the heart of virtually every spiritual teaching, be it Christian, Islam, Sufi, Buddhist, virtually every spiritual tradition reminds us of that inextricable oneness of life. So what I've learned from witnessing change, particularly in Ladakh or Little Tibet, but also in Bhutan, where I worked for over a 5-year period, and then in shorter trips and experiences with many other cultures, including, I must add, growing up in socialist Sweden and having German and English relatives, family, cousins, grandparents, So experiencing those cultures, as well as living and working in America and quite a few others, partly part of my linguistic training. I studied in France and Italy and Mexico and so on. So this broad experience of different cultures has led me to look ever more at this issue of human happiness. And what I'm seeing around the world is that the general situation today is that all the signs are that we are becoming less happy as a macro trend. As a macro trend, if we look at the statistics that would indicate human well-being, human contentment, human beings having meaningful lives, living at peace with themselves and with others and with the rest of creation, the indicators, the macro indicators are not good. I want to stress that I also see in the last 5 years in particular a very encouraging trend, and that includes seeing a very, very encouraging turn in these remote ancient cultures, like again in Ladakh or Little Tibet where I've worked, where in the last 5 years there is a very profound rethinking going on there. And it's partly due to the work that I helped to start, but not only. There's a rethinking going on in many places today, and I think that, I don't know if anyone has spoken about this earlier, but I think the analysis in America of cultural creatives is a very, very significant sign of what I'm talking about. How many of you have heard about the analysis regarding cultural creatives in America? Not so many, so I'll tell you about it. In America, and again I'm seeing this in virtually every culture and country that I have connection with, there is a micro trend going on where some estimate that 20 to 30% of people are turning away from the dominant consumer culture towards a culture of meaning, towards a culture of creativity. One of the signs of this I see everywhere is a micro trend towards turning the television off and making more of our own music, making more of our own culture. That's part of what being culturally creative is about. And this is a quiet and a silent trend if you look at the mainstream media. If you don't go beyond that to papers like Positive News, to the sort of literature, the magazines and the books that are here at this conference, then you won't hear about it, you won't see it. But when you look closer to the ground, and when you get all that alternative literature, and you get those emails and the newsletters and read the books, you will see that it's very real. And even more importantly, on the ground it's very real. Now, even in this ancient culture of Ladakh or Little Tibet, that trend is beginning to happen. And it's remarkable, because I want to tell you a little bit more about this place, for those of you who haven't heard about it or don't know about it. Can I ask how many of you have heard of Ladakh? And how many of you are familiar with my book, Ancient Futures? Well, it's Ladakh, as more than half of you know then, it's a part of Tibet culturally. It's on the westernmost edge of the Tibetan plateau, but it's a part of Tibet that belongs politically to India. And it was sealed off from the outside world from 1947, when India gained its independence from Britain. And it was completely sealed off from the outside world because it was considered a very strategic border zone for India. And so when the Chinese started coming into Tibet, the Indians wanted to hold on to this territory, and they were very nervous of spying of any kind or any sort of interference. So they didn't let anyone up there except army along the borders. And even the family of the army were not allowed up there. It was considered so sensitive and so strategic. And so this area, this part of Tibet, that is culturally Tibetan, the Dalai Lama is the spiritual head, it's up on the Tibetan plateau, did not suffer the same tragic changes that the Chinese part of central Tibet did. And it was completely sealed off, as I say, until 1974, when the Chinese, who were constantly, there was fighting on the border all the time, and they had managed to build a road through the mountains from China into Pakistan, through this part of Indian Tibet, or Ladakh, without the Indian army even knowing it, because these mountains are so high and so remote. And so the Indians wanted to place this area on the map as Indian territory, and they suddenly allowed outsiders to come in. And I went out originally as part of a film team. I was a linguist. I was asked by a documentary filmmaker to come along, because this part of the world was so unknown and had been so sealed off that they wanted someone who could try to pick up a little bit of the language to facilitate the making of this documentary, anthropological film. I went out expecting to be there for 6 weeks, and I haven't left, 30 years later. I fell in love with the place and the people. It was absolutely astounding. I had been to the part of the world that's now where the Zapatistas are in Mexico, in San Cristobal de las Casas in the 60s, and I had sort of fallen in love with the Indio tribes there at that time. I had seen other remote parts of the world, but I had never seen anything like this. And I believe that it was because Ladakh was so sealed off, was so independent, and wasn't influenced by either colonialism or later on by what we call development. So what I encountered were people who were so much wealthier than anything I would have expected. Remarkable standard of living. The houses were 3 stories high and painted white. The women had jewelry that was all imported. They were on the silk route, and they had corals, turquoise, gold, silver, beautiful jewelry that clearly showed that it was more than just subsistence, because all of these things had to be imported. In other words, they had traded excess to gain this wealth, which was a type of bank, really. Also, I found an astoundingly high level of health. I was amazed compared to what I had seen in other parts of the world. And most importantly, I found the happiest people I'd ever encountered. The most open, tolerant, joyous people I had ever encountered anywhere. So this is what made me fall in love with the people and the place. It also was very beautiful. The villages spread out over an area about the size of Austria, but because this is a desert, high altitude desert, there was a very low population. In about 100 villages, you had about 100,000 people spread out over this very large area. And the desert was then punctuated by brilliant green oases where they had irrigated the land from glacial meltwater from the higher Himalayan mountains around them. So people lived at about 12,000 feet, and the mountains, the higher mountains around, were over 20,000 feet. And so it was a little bit of a sort of a Shangri-La, really. I don't want to pretend that everything was perfect. I found it difficult in winter, and in fact I didn't spend a lot of winters there because it was very, very cold in the winter, and there was basically no heating. And yet I was amazed at the fact that everyone would say to me, why don't you stay in the winter? The winter is the best time of the year. We have nothing but festivals then. We have so much more time. And I never heard anyone in the traditional culture when I first arrived complain of the cold. And I write in my book, Ancient Futures, about these amazing experiences of crossing a cold stream late in the autumn, and I was screaming with it, it was absolutely freezing cold. And this nun I was traveling with stopped in the middle of the water to point something out to me, didn't seem affected by it at all. And those sort of things happened all the time, making it very clear that people were very adapted to the environment. I can't tell you too much more detail about all of this, except then to say that I came across people who seemed more open, more tolerant, more self-assured, more at peace with themselves and who they were, and as a consequence, more tolerant of difference, more tolerant of diversity than any people I had ever come across. That diversity included, if we were hiking and had a plan to go from village A to village B, and sometimes traveling with Ladakhis and Westerners, there would suddenly be an avalanche or just heavy snowfall or something that would get in the way. The reaction among the local people was, go this way or that way, or we go today or tomorrow, not a big difference. Whereas with the Westerners, there was always this feeling that, we had a plan in our heads and now we had to work a little bit at rearranging our mind to suit that reality which had changed. I feel I learned a lot from this, not that I can practice it, I learned what it's all about, to live in the now, the power of now, which I think this book is a very great... how many of you are familiar with the power of now? For me, that articulates what I learned from these ancient people. And I had written about it in my book. I had written about the way in which they seem to go in and out of a type of meditative state of mind and back into the more, if you want to call it, the more analytical, even within a sentence. We'd talk about, how are you? Where are you going today? And then, Om Mani Padme Hum. And isn't it a nice day? Back into the conversation, moving literally within a few sentences back and forth. Because obviously we can't always stay in that space of that sense of oneness. As we do things, as we talk, we move into another realm with different brain waves, basically. But I noticed how they could move in and out of that so fluidly and so quickly. And I have not learned to do that, but that's my practice, to try to do that. In learning from these people about happiness, I also must tell you that I learned a lot about unhappiness en route. There was a very, very dramatic change in Ladakh that happened as a consequence of the global economy coming in from the outside, not because local people had asked for it, but for geopolitical reasons. As I said, the Indian government decided to throw the area open. And from the outside world suddenly came a completely different way of doing things, a different culture. Key elements in that economics, what I would call an economics of unhappiness, key elements had to do with destroying relationships between human beings, basically breaking down community bonding, community ties, a community sense of helping one another, of being a part of one another. Another key was breaking down a sense of connection to the land, to the animals, to that place. And how did that happen? Well, what economic growth actually is about is separating producers and consumers from one another. We may not have thought about it that way before, but that is at a fundamental level what economic growth does, is to separate production and consumption further and further and further. Now, in the modern era, this shift in the economy was based on the belief that it is in every region's interest to specialize, to move away from producing for their basic needs, to move away from self-reliance, in order to specialize for distant markets. And then, if we specialize in what we're good in, so goes the economic theory, which is called the principle of comparative advantage. This principle of comparative advantage says that if we specialize in what we're good in and produce lots and lots of that, stop producing a whole bunch of things, just produce a few things and export, then you can import in what you need. And you can import a lot of things that you can't produce locally. So this principle is very, very sexy because it does seem to offer peoples around the world to have all sorts of things that we can't produce at home. And so, for instance, in Scotland, you might be very good at producing oats, but you can't produce oranges, and it's nice to have oranges in winter. But what we haven't been looking at enough, I don't think, is the fact that today, this economic theory has turned into a monstrous system where around the world we are importing and exporting identical products. I can't go into too much detail about how this works as a system, but from my point of view, rethinking today needs to be very, very much focused on the economy. I think we've done a lot of rethinking in terms of the spiritual, in terms of other aspects, but I think in terms of the economy, as it relates to happiness, in other words, you might say the link between the economy and psychology, spirituality, our inner world, our inner well-being, we haven't done enough thinking, I would argue. So when you see that the economy leads to literally fresh milk, butter, water being transported back and forth across the globe in larger and larger quantities as I speak, you will also find, if you go around the world, as I've done, you'll find that local products, as a general trend, cost more than products from far away. That local butter in Devon costs sometimes 4 or 5 times more than butter from New Zealand. Now, many people in their individual countries, in their individual villages, still believe the myth of comparative advantage and efficiencies of scale. So they believe that, okay, well, if we can't afford to eat fresh butter from the neighboring farm in Devon, it's because over there in New Zealand they're more efficient. And even though it's coming from literally the other side of the world, and it entails transport with lots of petroleum, and you're talking also about a perishable product that needs refrigeration, even so, it somehow makes sense that Devon butter would cost 1/5 of butter from a mile away, that New Zealand butter would cost 1/5 of butter from a mile away. Well, it doesn't. It really doesn't. And when you go around the world and you see that in Mongolia, where they have 25 million milk-producing animals, you cannot even find dairy products in Ulaanbaatar. They're from Germany, some from Holland. You go to Kenya and you find that Dutch butter costs half as much as Kenyan butter in Nairobi. I found in Spain Danish butter. In Denmark, I thought I might find Danish butter. No, French butter I was served in little plastic pots from France. Now this trade back and forth also included being served in Mongolia water bottled by Coca-Cola in Hong Kong. This is in Mongolia with all its water and its very sparse population. So what is happening in a very, very dramatic way today is a separation between people and their natural resources, and more dramatically, between people and people. The webs of connection, the webs of relationship are being cut very, very dramatically, very rapidly. So the economics of happiness, from my point of view, need to be an economics that connects us once again, that reweaves the fabric of life. That I would call localization instead of globalization. The economics of happiness is an economics that recognizes that intrinsic to our nature is a need to be seen, to be heard, to have a reciprocal relationship with other people around us, and to have a deeper experience of the natural world than we are getting in the current modern urban situation. I'm not going to be able today to spell out why in all its detail, but I can tell you about a few basic principles. But the very, very important thing I'd like to leave you with in this is that to shift towards an economics of happiness, away from the current path, is far easier than continuing on the current path. When I say easier, I mean that the only thing that's preventing us from doing that is that there has not been enough rethinking, or perhaps even thinking, about the economy as a system, about the economy as it affects the entire global population. So as a system, as a process of change, what we actually call progress is a consequence of economic policies. And the policies in place today, very much now, encouraged by the WTO, the US government is particularly active promoting this path. But unfortunately, every government in the world has taken that path of promoting a globalizing path that separates us further and further from one another and from the earth. So to change things, when I say it would be easier, I mean structurally, I mean economically, as a society, as a community. It would be easier for us to use our collective resources, our collective public funds, to steer in the opposite direction. It would cost us less money, and it would immediately start reducing the social ills and the environmental problems that we face. Now, today in particular, global warming is one of the most frightening trends that we're witnessing. It's going to be difficult to immediately have a beneficial effect on the climate, but we know that there is a relationship between global warming and petroleum consumption. We also know, even if our newspapers don't tell us that enough, that there is a connection between this current war and other wars and the search for this scarce, precious material called oil. And yet, even though we are fighting wars and brutalizing whole cultures to get cheap oil, so supposedly cheap oil, we're spending billions in the process, first of all. Even though we are doing that, and even though we know that global warming is a serious problem now, widely recognized, our finance ministers, and that means our political representatives from both left and right today, both left and right, are encouraging a type of growth, so-called, a type of progress that is separating production and consumption further and further and concentrating economic power, economic jobs in fewer and fewer hands. That concentration of power is also leading to a very dramatic loss of jobs, both in North and South. It is also leading, and it's important that we realize that with globalization we're told that, so now when we ring up on the here to find out the train time between Paddington and Oxford, there's someone in Bangalore, India, answering the phone. How many of you know that? Yeah. Now we're told we shouldn't grumble about this because it's very good for these people, because it's giving them jobs. Well, in India today, there are often 10,000 people applying for one job. And the reason for this is that inherent in the dynamic of this economy, structurally, the forces that separate producers and consumers are, as I say, concentrating economic activity and jobs in fewer and fewer hands, in the hands of large mobile corporations, also in fewer and fewer places. And the trend worldwide, very dramatic, is that the places where the jobs are larger and larger urban centers. In the West, they're becoming suburbanized sprawls as everyone tries to live where it might be a little greener and maybe not so expensive, but still have a job in London or in a few places where there are still jobs to be had. Same thing in India, in Bombay, Calcutta, in a few places, the mega cities just grow. This is entirely a consequence of economic policy, and those economic policies are a political choice. The price of what we pay in the marketplace today, when something from 20,000 miles away costs less than something from 1 mile away, totally ignoring all that petroleum, the war, the global warming, the instability that brings in terms of, as we're seeing now, floods and so on. When those prices tell us that this is worth, £3 and that's worth £10, they are a political choice, a political choice. They have nothing to do anymore with the price of labor, resources, capital invested. I shouldn't say nothing. They have, in some cases, a little bit to do with that, but every year less and less. It's a political choice. What we choose to subsidize, what we choose to tax. One of the key things we could do that would shift the entire economy overnight would be to shift taxes away from human labor and put them onto natural resources, particularly oil. That shift would immediately transform the economy. And remember, we are not talking about suddenly doing everything by hand and saying that we're not going to have any technology. There are, first of all, enormous amounts of evidence that show that decentralized renewable energy can answer our needs. We can't transfer to that overnight in Britain, but we could help countries like India and China to implement a renewable energy path. That's one of the key elements of the economics of happiness. But as we talk about renewable energy, we need to keep in mind that in terms of human happiness and sustainability, we need to be very careful not to embrace centralizing and centralized large-scale renewable energy installations, because there we are immediately essentially pushing people into these larger and larger mega cities. A balance between rural and urban, a balance between village, town, smaller city, larger city, is still a possibility in many parts of the so-called third world. What I mean by that is that roughly half the global population still lives on the land. Roughly half the global population. It is still possible to make a U-turn in policies, and the most important structural ingredient would be decentralized renewable energy infrastructures. I'm sorry if this is a bit technical and detailed right now, but I think what we have shown in Ladakh is that the decentralized renewable energy infrastructure cost a fraction of what the government is doing there, and what they're being pressured to do by the World Bank, and of course now the WTO, by the pressures from the G8 countries, the conventional development path, which today very often is shrouded in a language of sustainability, of cultural diversity, concerns about participatory development. The language has changed, but the practices are actually worse than they were 20 years ago. And I can give you one good example of that, which is that the Swedish government and the Danish government both subsidized Ancient Futures when it first came out. They subsidized it so it had color photographs, full color, every page, big photographs. They helped to promote it. They funded our work in Ladakh to promote an economics of happiness, a decentralist, renewable energy-based path of development. And today, they wouldn't go near that book. They've withdrawn funding. And yet the language, if you read the language of the aid agencies, it sounds far greener and far more socially concerned than it was. Now, this is an issue which I've mentioned now too late. Perhaps in the discussion we can talk more about that. But the issue I'm addressing right here is why I believe that rethinking is so fundamental. We have been getting a lot of language from government and industry, particularly since the Rio conference in '92, about sustainability, and as I say, about cultural diversity, about biodiversity. But in actual fact, the economic policies have not changed direction. And in not changing direction, they have magnified, they have increased the scale of the destruction. The good news is that people from the ground up are rethinking. So I see this groundswell of rethinking that is also happening, as I said, with the cultural creatives, what's happening in every culture, and it is a realization that the current system is not working and that we need a different system, we need a different process, we need to move in a different direction. The key to that direction is decentralizing, which is another word for localizing. And we are not talking, when I say localizing, we're not talking about all of us going back home now to our own town, our own community, and only looking at our own community. We're talking about an understanding of the global economy and all its ramifications. And as I say, if we really pay attention to what people need, to what makes them happy, the decentralizing, localizing path becomes a very, very obvious and logical and necessary alternative. But we're looking at the localizing from an international point of view, and we are talking about attaining it through international collaboration. So international collaboration, which we might call globalization of the people's movements. I would prefer to call it international collaboration, so that we don't confuse a very specific process of economic trade treaties, which are what is behind economic globalization. So we shouldn't confuse that with really the opposite, which is about international collaboration to solve the issues of environmental breakdown, human rights abuses, and more than that, not just solve the problems. How can we embrace, how can we engage in actually creating an economics of happiness? As I said before, I think it is far easier, it costs less money. And why is it easier? Because it corresponds to what people need, to what they want. I'd like to give you, before I stop, I'd like to give you a concrete example of why decentralizing is so fundamental and so important. In Ladakh, I was witness to the changes that led to these incredibly joyous, tolerant, peaceful people suddenly becoming unhappy, divisive, even violent. Within a 15-year period, changes started happening that led to such pressure on them, on their sense of identity, on their culture, that it led to violent bloodshed. Buddhist grandmothers said to me, "We have to kill all the Muslims or they will kill us." They had got that from their teenage grandsons who had been coming back home telling their parents and grandparents that the Muslims in Ladakh were threatening the Buddhist well-being, the Buddhist power and economy. In Bhutan, I saw exactly the same pattern in the same period. Peaceful coexistence for generations between Hindus and Buddhists. And within roughly a 15-year period, they were killing each other. The Buddhist government has been accused of ethnic cleansing. As I witnessed in Kashmir, in Muslim Kashmir, bloodshed absolutely out of control and continuing now for the last more than 20 years. So from where I'm standing, the increased fundamentalism, violence, bloodshed, terrorism are connected to this economics of unhappiness. I quickly like to outline the main ingredients. It's more systemic than what I can tell you now. But one of the elements I saw was that young people were at one and the same time told, you are not right the way you look, the language you speak, the clothes you wear, your culture is wrong. If you want to be somebody, you should look like this. And this was portrayed in advertising, television, films. And what were the key ingredients? They were white, Western, urban consumer culture, with the fast car, with the incredible power and wealth that was portrayed in the media. I witnessed firsthand. I spoke the language fluently, I lived with the people, and I knew them intimately when that loss of self-esteem was not a part of their psyche. And I saw how these images and information, even in villages where they didn't have television, where they didn't see the images, they still heard that in the West, people are so clever, they're educated, they have science, and they've developed these technologies, they don't have to work. And they have infinite amounts of money. This, to the young, led very importantly to a sense of inferiority, that their parents were stupid to tell them to work and to, maintain this culture when here was something that was so far superior, obviously so much better. The imagery led to young men starting to imitate Rambo, literally, walking around with a cut-off t-shirt, the jeans, trying to look like Rambo. The girls trying to look like Barbie Doll. Now, what I'm talking about is a global phenomenon. In China, wealthy women are operating on their eyes to make them look more Western. All across the world, you will find a sale of blue contact lenses advertised with, have the color of eyes you wish you had been born with. And you will find everywhere, as I have found in the countries I work, dangerous skin lightening creams. In Ladakh it's called Fair and Lovely, to make your skin lighter. And so I witnessed how young girls started feeling that the color of their hair, their eyes, everything was wrong about them. Now the interesting thing is, tragic, but also very important and very interesting, is to realize that even in my native country of Sweden, where the majority of girls, the majority have blonde hair and blue eyes and look a lot more like Barbie Doll than they do in China or Ladakh, there the rates of bulimia and anorexia keep going up and up and up, destroying young women's lives. So none of us are safe from this phenomenon, but in our culture we haven't identified the external forces enough. We haven't seen the link to an economy that is creating role models through media and advertising rather than flesh and blood local people. That's the key, is that as a child, if we grow up molding our identity on living human beings in proximity with them, we never develop that same sense of inferiority. Because even the most beautiful girl will not be the best one to dance, will not be the one who also has a good sense of humor. We human beings all have our skills and our strengths and our beauties to offer. And in a human scale society, where the main sense of identity comes from real, live, flesh and blood role models, you have a very different psychological effect. Now, this is one dimension. Now, simultaneously, these young people were told, get an education, go to school. And the message is, in the most remote villages of China, in Ladakh, everywhere I go, the message is, if you get a good education, you might be able to get a really good job, and if it's really, really good, you might even be able to get that ticket to the West, where you can go and live in this paradise, where the streets are paved with gold and there is so much money, and you might want to come back someday with a huge bag full of money, but the ticket to the city and the good job is the education. In Ladakh and in Bhutan and in many places, the failure rate in school was 90%. So these young people were put in school, taught a curriculum which had nothing to do with their own resources, their own economy, their own culture, their own religion. It was a training for a Western-style, urban consumer culture. It's basically a training for a globalizing economy. The majority are not getting those jobs. So at the same time as they're told that everything about you is wrong, deeply, they're told they're going to get wealth and get success through this modern education. The modern education pulls them into the city in search of jobs. So it's an urbanizing. The globalizing economy is constantly urbanizing, centralizing. And in that urban squalor, the majority are poorer. The majority are not getting jobs. So I hope that that to some extent explains why I am talking about decentralizing or localizing as a key systemic turn towards an economics of happiness. The decentralizing has to do with allowing, again, it's a bit complex, but the rethinking is what we need. The rethinking about the fundamental structures of the economy. Another element in all of this is that the current economy, by concentrating jobs, is actually making human intelligence, human care and heart scarce and expensive. So that one shift I talked about earlier, shifting taxation away from human labor onto resources, would dramatically change the entire playing field. We would then have more teachers, more nurses, more professors, more shoemakers, more bakers, more house builders, more of everything. At the moment, the scarcity of jobs is entirely a political choice. And everywhere in the world you go, the gap between rich and poor is widening, and fewer people have the jobs. The ratio between the doctor and the patient, between the teacher and the student, between the baker and the people who eat the bread, all of that ratio is moving in the wrong direction towards scarcity and making it expensive, because we're constricting jobs, constricting knowledge, centralizing it instead of decentralizing it. So another way to think about to rethink the economy is towards an economy of more jobs, an economy of true growth, more businesses instead of fewer. And the key element is decentralization. For me, the most inspiring thing today is to know that at the same time as we speak, this micro trend towards cultural creatives, towards all the millions of initiatives that are covered in the alternative literature here, are still managing to happen. And I would give as one of the key economic movements the local food movement. The local food movement is a key movement towards an economics of health, happiness, and sustainability. So if you wanted to do something right now, if you don't want to spend too much time rethinking, then getting involved in strengthening, supporting, promoting a local food movement that will mean that 10 years from now, local food, fresh local food, the basics of the wheat and the potatoes and the milk and the meat, if you eat it, the eggs, that they would come from the region rather than the other side of the world. An international local food movement is one of the healthiest and strongest countercurrents to the current trend, and it is happening. And I also feel so inspired and so convinced that we can make the change, that we will make the change, because the people I know who are engaging in that more human, human scale as well, localizing, revitalizing, shift, are the happiest people I know. Thank you. I hope you'll stay for questions, because we still have some more time. In fact, we have quite a lot more time. Yeah. Yes?
Hi, my name's Phoenix. I'm a singer-songwriter, amongst other things. And I very rarely do watch TV. That's one of the things I don't do. But I did last night, and it was, for one of the first times I came across the Simon Cowell character, who's very big in putting people off in musicians. Oh, hi. I don't know if you heard that. Okay, start again. Hi, I'm Phoenix. I'll bow to the majority here. And I'm a singer-songwriter as well as working for peace. And one of my passions is live music, and that people own that and do it for themselves. And I was appalled, absolutely appalled last night when, on the very few times I watched TV, I did actually watch The X Factor and saw Simon Cowell absolutely, mercilessly telling people they couldn't sing. Personally, I don't believe anybody can't sing. And it's part of our kind of joy of living on this planet that we can sing and that we learn to sing. And I don't know if anybody has a sort of ideas forward that. I don't really want to write him and say what I think of him, but I just, would encourage everybody to sing whether or not they think they can do it. Just go for it.
I'd actually like to add something that I left out of my talk, and that is that one of the things we do in my organization, I run a small organization called the International Society for Ecology and Culture. And we have a small office here in Britain. We're very, very small, but we're very international. And one of the things that we encourage in terms of this rethinking is that people get together in their community, meaning if you live in Oxford or London or wherever it is, that you try to find people who are within relatively easy access to meet regularly, to do the rethinking. We put together a curriculum which deals with the issues from really collecting articles from all around the world, and it gives a very different picture from the mainstream conventional one. And what we encourage is that as you do that process of rethinking, you might also engage in forming that different culture. So many people like to sing together, they like to meditate together, they may go out into nature together. We're sort of encouraging a DIY culture. And that includes even a DIY vision quest, for instance. You don't have to go on expensive vision quests paying thousands of pounds. You can go out with friends and decide to do it yourself. You obviously need to be informed, and you may not do it in such an extreme way, but helping your children to spend time in nature in a way that is about connecting to nature, feeling a part of nature, rather than just batting a ball back and forth, is one of the most simple and direct paths to a culture of transformation and joy and happiness. And the other element that I learned in Ladakh is that one of community. And the community building that you can do while you rethink these big questions is a wonderful process of actually starting to create a group that wants to have a different culture, that wants to live differently, while also really rethinking some of these bigger issues that take a bit of thinking about, because we've been subjected to so much propaganda in the opposite direction. So we call this a Roots of Change program, and if you're interested, please contact my office. I should maybe give you our website for those of you who are interested. It's www.isec.org. So it's isec.org.uk. And the other thing we have is materials that we call a local food toolkit, where we put together some posters, a slideshow. We have a book called Bringing the Food Economy Home. We were actually very happy that we won an award this year from the Local Food Writers Guild for this local food toolkit. And we actually started the local food program at the Soil Association about 12 years ago. We funded the beginnings of promoting local food in Britain. But it still needs a lot more work, and it needs work not just from farmers, from people like you and me. And the main thing is getting the word out about how fundamental local food is to a healthier economy. And if I could just add that that doesn't mean no oranges in winter. It simply means let's have a diversity of production in Britain instead of larger and larger monocultures. Government plans are absolutely horrific in that regard, and the new CAP is full of language about environmental protection, but in actual fact it's a disaster. So you really have to look through the language of sustainability and green and human participation and so on. It's very, very much still in the wrong direction. Sorry for that, but yes. Oh, Mike is here. Okay.
Can I ask a very nice question about this butter? I don't understand how it costs so much less to ship butter from New Zealand, for example. Is it just that the government put on taxes, and how does this square up with the fact that the developing nations are not able to import their stuff to us because the American economy, for example, puts on a whole lot more taxes? I'm afraid I don't understand this.
No, I think really to understand how it is that butter from 1 mile away costs more than butter from 20,000 miles away, I'm afraid that I'd recommend reading my book, Ancient Futures, because I talk there about the fact that it's a systemic transformation of economic transactions. It's systemic. It has to do with what we train people for, what skills. It has to do with the choice of technologies. One of the things that the technologies are doing is to speed life up faster and faster and faster. And those of us who have jobs are being absolutely, we're more than pressured. We basically have to compete at the speed of the available technologies. So this in turn leads to choices and to activities that are very detrimental, both to our happiness and health and to the well-being of the rest of life. So it is a system of change, and it has to do with the hidden subsidies, what we call subsidies, that are often not direct subsidies, that they are grants for a particular type of research, for a particular direction. And you see, going way back, the assumption has always been, as I said earlier, I said about trade, the assumption has been specializing for distant markets is always good. And the assumption has been more technology is a plus for human society. We have way overstepped the mark of balance, of what really does make us happy, what does maintain health. And that's where we need to do the rethinking. It's not a linear, simple answer. And that's why I think very few people have been dealing with it. And another thing I'm talking about is also that we need to think about the economy. We cannot leave it to the economists. We cannot leave it to the politicians. We need to do that. And I hope that the term economics of happiness will interest you and will interest more people, because that is really what it's about. Our well-being, our inner contentment.
Hi, I just wanted to follow on from the last question about telling people what the local food activity is here in Oxfordshire. There are 3 communities within cycling distance producing food. One of them is called Brazier's College, and they're very active with county councillors from different counties, I think, in getting farms that can have involvement of people from nearby towns. That's investing money, investing work, and receiving some of the crop. I forget what it's called, but is it like share farming or something? Maybe you know.
Community-supported agriculture,
yes,
maybe?
exactly.
Yeah.
So that's Brazier's College near Wallingford, if anyone's local. And also the Quaker group on sustainable living have got people very interested in permaculture, and if anyone's got a garden or an allotment in Oxford, there are volunteers available who want to complete their diplomas in permaculture, so there's help available for converting your garden to permaculture. That's at 43 St Giles, which is about 200 meters in that direction. And it's open now and certainly tomorrow morning because it's Sunday morning.
Could I also say, while we're transitioning with the mic, that one thing we advocate in my organization is that we think in terms of operating on two tracks. One track is looking at what we can do right now to make our lives more joyous, more rich, and contribute to positive change. But also the other track is what can we do collectively, and that really means politically. That can happen at the level of a small town or a local council, or nationally or internationally, but we must also pay attention to the mileage we get if we move from thinking I to we. If we shift the I to a we, the incredible mileage, the power we get, and that's partly why we encourage that people do the rethinking in a group and then start, as they really thought it through, what is this thing called progress? What does growth really mean? What does development mean? As they've rethought that and then thought about what can we do, there's a real power in that we.
Hi, thanks for a very inspiring talk. I was thinking about one of the big issues on global trade. One of the big fights between the North and the South is that the South wants to export their agricultural products to the North. Many countries want to do that, and the North is defending its markets using subsidies against that. Now, if the North were to switch to local food production, the South would not have a market to export to. How would you square that?
I'm very glad you brought that up. Now, I very much hope that Vandana, I'm sure she will be addressing this tomorrow. I've been working with Vandana for about the last 15 years, and she will, I hope you all stay for Vandana Shiva's talk tomorrow, because coming from the South, I've been working in the South for 30 years, but I'm still a Westerner. She will tell you the same thing, and that is the South. The majority of people in the South are not benefiting from this export-led development. The vast majority are being impoverished by it. But you have, first of all, a very wealthy elite that benefits if the value of their currency is kept low, if they can offer slave labor on the global marketplace. In other words, if someone in China or India can work for $1 a day and still survive, they're going to be competitive in this global marketplace. So there's a very, very strong voice from the elite and from the governments of the South that is all about exporting to the North. But if you go and look above all on the ground, what is happening as a consequence of this increased trade. Now, one place that is really a very good place to do that in is Mexico, because Mexico was opened up through NAFTA with Canada and the US, and there are very clear signs. Much increased poverty, hugely increased gap between rich and poor. There's not a single country that I know of, I don't think you'll be able to find a single country in the world where the gap between rich and poor has not been increasing in the last 20 years. And that includes my native country of Sweden, it includes Australia, it includes Ladakh, Bhutan, these remote cultures. Now, hand in hand with that has been a globalizing, export-led economy where there has been more export and import from both North and South. The dominant analysis that you hear which says that our farmers are being very greedy and they're getting all these subsidies, and really we should stop subsidizing them and we should open up our markets. That is an analysis that McDonald's and Monsanto and Cargill love. That is their analysis. Do you know Cargill? Do you know it's the largest grain corporation? How many of you know Cargill? See, it's also interesting that most people haven't heard of it. It's the biggest multinational corporation trading in grain. So it requires a deeper thinking and looking on the ground. And there are a lot of people now who are looking, and there are more and more reports. But it's a very, very superficial analysis and throwing open our markets. Can you imagine? I mean, just think of it. In China, in India, we've got to realize that in rural areas, people are much less monetized. So that means that they're getting their food, their water, their clothing, their building materials without money. And that's how they can manage to then, the dollar that they're paid can give them some extra luxuries. So again, in my book, I describe how calculating things according to the dominant statistics is a complete madness. I saw there how in the traditional villages, where you had 3-story houses painted white, plenty of space, your own land, your own fibers for clothing, your adequate food, no one had ever gone hungry in living memory. There, I shouldn't say no one had ever gone hungry, that's a bit exaggerated. No one had ever heard of anyone dying of hunger, and there had been periods in villages when it had been short, but they'd been trading with other villages regionally, so no one had ever died of starvation. But anyway, and there was no poverty as there is now in the modern capital and in the slums. But according to economic yardsticks, when someone moves into a little hovel with a corrugated metal roof, no windows, no water to speak of, rats. I mean, I would like to take people on reality tours to really smell and feel and see the difference. In that hovel, if they're earning $1 a day, that's great for the economy. On paper, we would hear how much they benefited. We would hear how much they benefited from that modern, economic growth. And in reality, they've become much poorer. In Ladakh, I had an opportunity to see this in a very black and white way because the economy had not had several hundreds of years of influence through colonialism and so on. So it was very dramatic. Bhutan is another example. And if you don't know it, you might have read in Jane Taylor's article about Bhutan, where the king has said, we're more interested in gross national happiness than we are in gross national product. And
I was thinking of the effect we are having in this country on our children, because they get all their foods from supermarkets because of parents being so busy, and they have no conception of growing food in the garden, of new potatoes and foods in season. And when I was a child, one had the joy of strawberries in June, but we didn't expect strawberries at Christmas.
Yes.
And we expect them now, and they have no flavor whatsoever. And I'll give you, I'll try not to be too long, but as a quick example of my grandchildren, whom I'm very fond of, when I arrived in Oxford, there was a lovely apple tree. There's a lovely apple tree in the back garden, and the apples had fallen on the ground, so I rushed out to pick them up, beautiful red apples. And I said, what are these? They're gorgeous. I haven't seen any like these. And she said, they're Blenheim sunsets. And they're... eat them. On them, and they're all polished, and they taste disgusting, but never mind. They're so much better than these apples, which have perhaps a little beastie inside. Well, I just quickly cut out the beastie and enjoyed the rich flavor.
I hope that you have heard.
I'm sure the beastie knew how good the flavor was, and so did I. And because they won't eat them, I peeled 7 pounds of apples for my daughter to put in her freezer.
I hope that you have heard about the local food initiatives that are trying to bring things like, in America, a friend of mine started something called the edible schoolyard. You know, they're sort of digging up the pavement, and children are actually learning how to grow food. And in so many cases, they love it. There is a real burgeoning, very small and very underfunded and not very visible yet, local food movement that is happening internationally. And it involves wonderful things like having children, even very young children, learn how to grow and care for, and then in some cases they even have a kitchen again, and they start, they learn how to cook again. Now, these initiatives are absolutely wonderful and vital, and we can start making them happen now. And they are working amazingly. But if the dominant macroeconomic trends continue, it is all the time undermining it. It's, among other things, it's undermining that because of the time factor. There's a relationship between globalization and lack of time. So that slowing down and localizing are structurally linked. And why I feel so convinced, and why I know that localizing is a path that is easier and that is less expensive and that is possible, is that there is that relationship. And anyone who lives in the modern world today must surely see what it's doing to our lives when we have not enough time to spend time in nature with our children, the singing and dancing I talked about earlier. What is that doing to us? And why is that happening? Just thinking on that issue, why do we have so little time? Sadly, a lot of people blame themselves, and they think, oh, I must budget my time differently. They don't realize that it's a global pattern that is happening in the Himalayas, it's happening in China, and it's for economic reasons. The economics that have to do with the subsidies for longer and longer distances and larger scale technologies. And when I say larger scales, I mean technologies that have a more and more global impact. They may look very small. Nanotechnology is the smallest you can get, and it's very, very frightening, and it has to do with patenting knowledge, controlling knowledge, and centralizing the economic power. It's a direct, giant step beyond biotechnology in the wrong direction. So please watch out for these changes. Don't let the propaganda and the language lure you into thinking that if small is beautiful, as Schumacher said it, well then surely nanotechnology must be beautiful. Sorry, yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to mention, are you aware of the local sustainability bill that's coming up in this country? And also, there's a wonderful grassroots campaign spreading across the UK at the moment, which is called Local Works. And if people are interested in that, on the web, the website is all the w's.localworks.org. I think it might have a UK at the end, I'm not sure. But that's actually about really, I suppose it is national collaboration of different groups and individuals, but it's not about centralization. It's about trying to bring that power back into local communities and thinking about local economics and that sustainability of local communities.
Excellent. I didn't know. No, I didn't. Does that come? Well, anyway. But that sounds very, very good. There's no doubt that there is a micro trend towards localization, and I've been trying to promote it for 20 years, and it's been very, very noticeable in the last 5 years. there is a very clear trend towards more and more discussion and implementation of it. And it needs to happen, as I said, at the grassroots level, but also in terms of policy.
I've brought something very small for you to do, something local and practical. This morning on my way here, I bought a tray, some tea towels, some plastic cups, and a jug. It has water in it. I would like you to drink the water, possibly keep your cup, because otherwise it will be destroyed, and to keep the jug replenished. I think in that way we can actually alter, over the next few days, our attitude to our local water. It is drinkable. Thank you. Just a sec. Beneath the blue cloth on the left, yes, there, is the mechanism to keep you responsible for your local water.
Yes, my point was, I couldn't help wondering when you were talking about Ladakh, what it was amongst the young people there that made them so susceptible to the influences coming in from outside, given what you'd said about the kind of the relative richness of the culture,
yes,
the closed sort of environment, and what might sound to many of us like an ideal environment, what it was that made them so ready to do their own rethinking,
yeah,
and to turn against what had been their culture from the start.
I'm so glad that you heard that I said it was the young, because I would tell you that very often Westerners will say, well, if these people had such a wonderful culture, why do they let it be destroyed like that? But they don't hear that I've underlined that it's via the young. Now, basically, I would tell you that every young child is extremely vulnerable. Extremely, remember, I don't know if you remember the Jesuits talking about that, give me a child under 6 or whatever, and I can. So, essentially, little children are looking for guidance, are looking to be molded and trained into a particular culture. They are like little sponges sucking things up. And I just sat on the train next to a girl who was obviously Afro, half black skin and white. And she had her little blonde Barbie doll with her, and she was showing her off to me, and her mother looked quite shocked. And when I said, well, I think you're actually much prettier than Barbie, but it won't do much good. But it's little children here. I have friends who've started looking at these things, and they found that 3-year-old girls will say, I want to look like Barbie. I'm not thin enough. 3-year-olds. So children are extremely vulnerable, and it can sound very depressing for us. But I tell you, if we're more aware of it, it's much easier to change than we think. It's as isolates and individuals, no. We need to surround ourselves with people who have similar values and who are beginning to think along these lines. But there are a lot of things we could do at the local school and at the local level if we're really aware of how insidious those influences are. So little children, I believe that as we think about cultures and cultural change and the future, understanding this fact that our young children are so vulnerable and so in need of guidance and so in need of a cultural model that takes them towards wholeness, towards self-respect, towards more creativity, towards contact with nature in a spiritual way, and towards community, that is a vital area to look at. However, having said that, I don't think that we have the time today to just focus on our kindergartens and schools. We need to be looking at the politics and economics of happiness as policy instruments policy instruments that could really very easily change the whole trajectory towards that path.
Could we have one more?
Talking about time, I know you don't have much time. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. And I love what this lady was saying over here, even though we couldn't hear it. You could just feel it, couldn't you, from what she was saying. I farm in Australia, and we're building the very model that you're talking about. So it's happening right now. And we have been touring in this country and visiting biodynamic farms. And the model we have in Australia covers several thousand acres, so it's a little bit different than the very tiny farms, but the principles are the same. And in talking about time, I just wanted to make one point, and that is that the average farmer in this country, in Australia and in the United States, and I'm sure in Europe, is close to 60 years old. So we don't have much time, because the food and the farmers and foresters and fishers of the world are getting old. And if we don't train the young people, especially in natural farming, and the systems have to change to do this, then they won't be here, and it'll be left to the very large corporations.
Yes.
So I just want to make that point. Thank you very much for what you've said.
Again, I just want to reiterate that I think that in terms of taking action right now, there is no single area that could more dramatically shift the entire global economy than focusing on food and farming. And remember, there is nothing else that we human beings produce that every person on the planet needs for survival 3 times a day. And yet the only thing we produce that everyone needs for their survival, that activity is marginalized, I keep hitting that one, is marginalized to this side issue when it comes to economic negotiations. It's seen as a stumbling block to free trade treaties, and most of us do not look at it centrally enough. And remember then, that yes, fibers are important, but we could live for a very, very long time even if we didn't get any new clothes to our communities or homes for years. Yes, building materials are important, but again, most people are living in buildings right now. The one thing that comes to us every single day that humans have produced is food. And changing that towards local, shorter relationships, shortening the distances in a systemic way, would totally change the industrial, corporate-run economy. It's the biggest threat to the corporate world, which is also why Safeways and a lot of big supermarkets now will use the word local, but be very wary. That is not helping to rebuild local food systems. It cannot. The big supermarket chains, because they're part of a global investment structure, they are being pushed in the opposite direction in reality. And on the surface, they're bringing in a little bit of local, but pressuring the farmers in a way that perpetually undermines the diversification and the shift to organic that is needed. So we have to understand the finance side of it, how it relates to localizing as well. Food and farming and helping children to connect to food and farming has a spiritual as well as an economic, as well as an educational benefit. And did you know that when people are in hospital and they even have a window out that shows them a tree or nature, that they heal faster than when they're cut away from it? So this connection to nature linked to the economic transition can happen most efficiently via food. Thank you.